My name is Amar. My name is Amar Wahab. I'm assistant professor in gender, sexuality, and women's studies at York University, and I'm currently the coordinator of the Sexuality Studies program at York University. I'm pleased to be here, and I would like to say thank you very much for being part of this sort of collective gathering this morning. Can I move this? I'm afraid I'm going to throw it down. Thanks. Thank you. So basically, my work looks at the intersection of race and sexuality, and much like Kyle's presentation, a lot of it riffs off Kyle's presentation to some extent in the sense of thinking about sexuality not just as sexuality. As Audre Lorde says, we don't live single-issue lives, and so therefore what we come to understand as sexuality is not something that is totally just a given. Sexuality is a very highly complex field of knowledge, and we need to think about how issues of race, class, geography, all these things sort of map into an understanding of sexuality. Thanks. So the title of my paper is called Jamaicanizing Homophobia. Implied in this title is that I'm actually not here to talk about Jamaica, but I'm looking at the ways in which this thing that we call Jamaica, this label that we call Jamaica in itself circulates globally and has certain kinds of meanings. And so my paper is really not so much a critique about homophobia in Jamaica, but it's a critique about the Canadian sort of discourse about homophobia in Jamaica itself. And I'll explain what I mean by Jamaicanizing homophobia, but I'm looking at this in the context of the Stop Murder Music campaign in Canada, and I'll explain that a bit. So, introduction. So the Western model of sexual citizenship, which articulates gay and lesbian rights as human rights, has served to brand Western nation states, especially Canada, as capable of bringing sexual freedom to nation states, especially of the global south, that are projected as intolerant of non-normative sexualities and genders, and therefore antithetically positioned as abusers of human rights. My investigation in this paper is influenced by the critical anglings around this model, especially through Jasper Poir's conception of homonationalism, which Kyle spoke about, and Joseph Massad's work on the imperial missionary project of what he calls the Gay International. That is, what he cites as a global conglomerate of predominantly white Western gay organizations concerned with exporting Western sexual liberation to the global peripheries, branding nations in the global south as exceptionally homophobic, incapable of reasoning their own terms of sexual freedom, and therefore in need of some kind of Western liberatory intervention. The dominant model of global queering enacted by this Gay International presumes a trans-cultural or universal conception of homophobia and homosexuality as discursive complements which together work to singularize and universalize the conceptual framing of non-normative sexual contestation. David Murray poses the question, if the homosexual is not a universal category, then how can homophobia, a prejudiced premise exclusively on the dislike of homosexuals, exist as a universal form of discrimination? And so this is not to say that there is no homophobia, but it's to basically ask us to think about homophobia in all its complex dimensions in different locales. Situated within this line of questioning, Neville Hode suggests that this articulation concerns a dizzying array of competing literacies. How do we read the situation? How do we read race, homophobia, sexuality, gender, to translate and authorize particular truths about homosexuality and homophobia? In other words, both scholars critically situate gay and lesbian rights discourse as a particular regime of truth-making wherein the homosexual, visibilized in the global north as a fixed subject, is premised on the fetishizing of a certain idea of homophobia. That is, homophobia is always and only about something called homosexuality. What I would term categorical homophobia, so there is a straight line between homophobia and homosexuality, and this paper is asking us to think much more complexly about that straight line. It is upon this categorical understanding of homophobia as the dominant analytic of homo-hatred that the human rights interventions of the Gay International are premised and deployed. Yet, might we rethink the problem of homophobia as a more culturally complex phenomena that is structured through locally significant categories of gender, sexuality, race, class, nation, and/or religion? Through the Western disciplinary technology that manufactures categorical homophobia out of these complexities, post-colonial nation states of the global south are therefore indexed and reiteratively hailed onto the global stage as self-evidently and exceptionally homophobic, making them globally domesticatable and therefore governable through Western intervention. And I should just say at this point that this is just part of a larger project that looks at Jamaica, Iran, and Uganda, and the way in which these three sites themselves have actually, sort of been spotlighted in the global sort of stage as, superbly homophobic, right? So I'm trying to think about the post-coloniality of these spaces or the coloniality of these spaces. In this paper, I investigate the ways in which discursive projections about homophobia in the post-colonial nation-state of Jamaica through the Stop Murder Music campaign in Canada reveal more about the ways in which the Gay International, more so in Canada, has become inextricably tethered to the Canadian national project. So my project is not so much about critiquing Jamaica per se, but it's critiquing Canada. I argue that the Stop Murder Music Canada campaign, situated within the human rights turn in global LGBT activism, effectively operates as an agent of homo-nationalist governance, rendering Jamaica, so there is an act of translating Jamaica that's going on and the rendering of Jamaica, and its national culture of dancehall music, now recoded in the campaign as murder music, intelligible as categorically homophobic, by default producing Canada as exceptionally tolerant and post-homophobic. So I'm interested in the ways in which these kinds of transnational global LGBT activism not only serve to bring human rights to places like Jamaica, etc., but what are the returns of this kind of activism within the global north? What is the value, what is the purchase of this, not only to activists in the global north, but to the nation states of the global north at the same time? And I will say this precisely because, and as I said before, I'm looking at race and sexuality. How is it that we have so many countries in the global north that are so sort of sexually exceptional, that is, they're so tolerant of LGBT human rights, etc., while at the same time these countries are part of the war on terror, they're part of escalating Islamophobia, they're a part of escalating race relations within the global north itself. So this idea of the tolerant global north, I would like to sort of bring a question to that. So building on a so this is a bit of background about the campaign. Building on a groundswell of anti-homophobia activism in the US in the 1990s, the Stop Murder Music campaign was started in the UK in 2004, in part by Peter Thatchell, founder of the gay rights activist group Outrage, to censor allegedly homophobic Jamaican dancehall artists and their music, which supposedly incite violence against the murder of homosexuals, gay men in particular. The Canadian incarnation of the campaign in 2007 comprised queer Caribbean Canadian activists and organizations in Toronto, Ottawa, and Vancouver, the group EGAL, Equality for Gays and Lesbians Everywhere, and the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto, one of EGAL's long-standing allies in the fight for formal legal equality, among others. Representing an alliance of queer diasporic activists and rights-seeking agents, the campaign appealed to the Canadian Minister of Immigration to impose visa bans on murder music artists on the basis that it directly contravened the Canadian Criminal Code and the Canadian Human Rights Act as hate speech. And I think this idea of hate speech is something that also needs to be opened up. Unsuccessful in lobbying the Canadian government, the campaign then appealed to music distributors such as Apple, iTunes, HMV, etc., on the basis of their corporate social responsibility to pull dancehall tunes marked as murder music from their online stores, as well as lobbied entertainment venues to cancel their tour engagements. In 2008, EGAL allegedly dispatched a letter to the, open quotes, to the President and the CEO of Canada Post, requesting a meeting to discuss the use of the mail by record companies and bookstores to distribute dancehall music, close quotes. I see this as an ironic move given the organization's, this is EGAL, past struggles with state-based censorship in Canada. While much of the campaign in Canada targeted individual murder music artists, the focus shifted in 2008 when the coalition of activists proposed an economic boycott of Jamaican tourism in a bid to compel the Jamaican government to immediately denounce homophobic violence in the country and begin work on repealing laws criminalizing homosexuality. Though rescinded after 3 days, the proposed boycott shifted the moral panic from Canada to Jamaica. Underlying the shift is a culturalist discourse effortlessly traced through these artists to the Jamaican nation state, suggesting that the social, political, and cultural forces that mark dancehall music as categorically and exceptionally homophobic are somehow essentially Jamaican. This discursive project also operates in conjunction with the official Canadian state discourse of multiculturalism to hyper-visibilize, stigmatize, and police the Jamaican Canadian diaspora in urban centers in Canada, especially through discourses of criminalization of Jamaican Canadians, what Henry and Tater call the Jamaicanization of crime. And we have earlier precedents of this where there were shootings in Toronto, and the first thing that the chief of police would do, instead of investigating the situation in Toronto, the chief of police jumped on a plane to go to Jamaica to investigate why this crime had happened in Toronto. So this is the way in which crime, right, has been so conflated with blackness, and especially a certain brand of blackness, Jamaican Canadian blackness. So I see this, as related to the discourse on sexuality, and I'm going to talk about that just now. So as a form of racialized control, Jamaicanization discourses in Canada work to simultaneously distance Jamaican Canadians from Canadian citizenship while producing the Jamaican nation state as a failed national project. We see this discourse belabored in reports to the Stop Murder Music campaign in Canada's mainstream gay and lesbian media, Extra newspaper, which constructed Jamaica and dancehall music under the sign of murder music as naturally intolerant, excessively homophobic, and backward vis-a-vis gay, tolerant, and progressive Canada. The 24 articles found in Extra consistently provided examples and detailed narratives of Jamaican bashings juxtaposed with translated excerpts of homophobic lyrics, as systematically reducing the genre of dancehall music to a national culture of homophobic hate in Jamaica. And I see this as a form of culturalizing hate. And so the question here is, can we sort of reduce dancehall to murder music, right? Can we make that easy translation? Or is dancehall a much more kind of complex cultural phenomena that we need to also, begin to sort of dialogue with in much more complicated ways? In one article, managing editor at Extra, Matt Mills, discussed the decision to contest a play date by a Jamaican dancehall artist in Canada, arguing that, open quotes, Toronto's queer people have sent a clear message that we will not provide our tacit support to evangelists for homophobic violence. How sweet it is, how noble. It makes me so proud to be queer. Close quote. The pride that Mills feels by implicitly shaming and scandalizing this idea of Jamaica provides the conditions of possibility for homonationalist desires that underpin the Canadian nation-state's claims to sexual exceptionalism, a process through which Canadian gays are entered into sovereignty, that is, coming into the nation. If the production of Jamaica as exceptionally homophobic enters the gay sexual citizen, the Canadian gay sexual citizen, into the fold of Canadian nationalism, this narrowly articulated discourse of sexual tolerance is crucial to the national re-narration of Canada as post-homophobic. So the argument that I'm saying is that by stigmatizing Jamaica as sort of so superbly homophobic and sort of casting it into the sort of global hall of shame, what is happening is Canada is producing itself as post-homophobic. And I think that in itself is a certain kind of currency, not only to Canada, but also to a global sort of already established empire, right, within the global north. So this not only invisibilizes the continued structural and intersecting complexities of homophobia in Canada, but also the homonationalist production of Canada as post-homophobic depends on disconnecting homophobia from Canadian heterosexuality and heteronormativity. So there is no talk about heterosexuality and heteronormativity at all anymore in Canada. This is not the culprit. The culprit is now this Jamaican heteronormativity. So there is this kind of export, there's kind of transfer, right? There's a new circuit of meaning that is emerging that is allowing for the transfer of heteronormativity. And subsequently, we see the inextricable tethering of categorical homophobia to a firmly implanted and nationalized ultra-heterosexuality that is Jamaicanized. So I'm using here Jamaicanized as a form of meaning, as a way in which heterosexuality is now being transformed into something that is now outside of the nation, and one that very interestingly is being attached to blackness and a certain brand of blackness. Interestingly, the Dancehall Dossier, produced by Outrage, is crucial to understanding how dancehall music is made into a sign of hate as murder music, and therefore the legitimate object of address by the campaign. The dossier provides original texts and supposedly literal translations of songs, as well as explanatory side notes and operates as a standard mechanism of citation and interpretation across the campaign's global alliance. The literal is invoked as an automatic proxy to the empirical, and as such, the basis of making visible a self-evident hatefulness and fact of homophobia. While the lyrics of particular songs are undeniably homophobic in their literal translation, we must ask after how these literal translations perform a certain incitement to discourse that produces Jamaica and dancehall music as naturally hateful and categorically homophobic, while enabling claims of sexual exceptionalism by queer Canadians. Carolyn Cooper, Jamaican academic, suggests that the literal translation of the dancehall lyrics by the campaign serves to decontextualize the music and its performance, stripping it away from the Jamaican social, historical, and political context that shapes dancehall as a theatre of popular criticism and self-fashioning as the nation-state struggles to chart its trajectory of post-colonial modernity. And really the point I think that she's making here, Carolyn Cooper has come under a lot of fire for making these kinds of statements, is that what she's saying is that we need a much more complex argument or complex discussion about post-coloniality in Jamaica, and I think we've heard from previous sort of presentations. There is this idea of the legal law itself having a certain kind of hold in Jamaica, but there is something else. There is the history of Jamaican sovereignty, the struggles for sovereignty, the history of struggles of Jamaica under neoliberalism, economic struggles. These are the kind of struggles, these are the wider contexts in which we need to situate dancehall music. So instead of just framing it only as murder music, yes, it does incite murder, but we need to think about the religious sort of aspect. We need to think about the homophobia as not necessarily something that is rational, but that's something that is informed by a wider history and a wider context. So in the words of Neville Hode, what I'm basically saying is that, yes, I recognize the homophobia, but what I'm also saying at the very same time is that this is not simple homophobia. This is much more complex than what we've come to understand as homophobia. I think I'm going to leave it there and, open the floor for questions.